human is denied every day to hundreds of millions of people.
Dans ce temple des Nations Unies, nous sommes les gardiens d'un idéal. Nous sommes les gardiens d'une conscience. La lourde responsabilité et l'immense honneur qui sont les nôtres doivent nous conduire à donner la priorité au désarmement dans la paix.
We've got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop.
Chaque génération, sans doute, se croit vouée à refaire le monde. La mienne sait pourtant qu'elle ne le refera pas. Mais sa tâche est peut-être plus grande. Elle consiste à empêcher que le monde se défasse.
So, welcome everybody to our fifth day and last day of our Masterclass Global Actors for Peace Beyond the West and the Rest. I welcome warmly Professor Olivier de Frouville for having accepted, first of all, for being with us for this closing lecture. I apologize, we had some technical problems, so we start now with a few minutes of delay. I would like to give immediately the floor to Professor our doyen Ioannis Panoussis for a welcoming word, and after I will proceed to properly introduce Professor de Frouville.
Merci Valentina, bonjour à tous. Alors tout d'abord, à mon tour de saluer et de remercier le professeur de Frouville d'être avec nous aujourd'hui, de manière dématérialisée certes, mais avec nous sur cet événement majeur pour notre université. La Masterclass pour la paix est devenue une institution à la fois pour la faculté de droit, pour le master droit de l'homme, mais aussi pour tous les étudiants qui sont intéressés à ces thématiques générales, mais aussi pour notre université de manière générale et transversale, pour plusieurs raisons. La première, mais vous l'avez vécu tout le long de la semaine, c'est la transdisciplinarité qui, du coup, permet en réalité, aussi bien aux juristes qu'aux politistes, qu'aux historiens, qu'aux géographes, de venir s'intéresser, échanger et contribuer au contenu de cette masterclass et effectivement permettre d'avoir une vision à 360 de phénomènes que nous étudions souvent d'une manière beaucoup plus technique et sous un prisme qui n'est pas forcément celui que nous avons décidé de prendre ici. Naturellement, d'autres raisons qui sont plutôt liées à cette idée que notre université souhaite avoir quelque chose à apporter en termes de service à la société. Et là, sur cette thématique-là, sur la question de la paix, c'est effectivement une volonté assumée, comme je le disais lors de la première journée, d'essayer de sensibiliser à minima et de faire de chacun de nous, à la sortie de ces semaines qui secouent généralement les individus qui sont présents, pourquoi pas des ambassadeurs généraux pour un monde meilleur. Voilà, ça c'est juste quelques éléments généraux sur le fond. Je ne suis pas certain de pouvoir être avec vous à la fin à cause des différentes annonces ministérielles hier soir. Donc, permettez-moi de prendre juste 3 minutes en introduction. Dans un premier temps, pour remercier les 3 personnes sans lesquelles cette masterclass n'aurait pas fonctionné avec ce niveau de qualité. Donc, je les prends dans l'ordre où je les vois, plus une personne qui est derrière un logo. Donc, un grand merci à Sonia Lourdes-Bourrielec, pour tout ce qu'elle fait depuis longtemps, pour nous avoir bousculé aussi, pour nous ouvrir, un peu comme le dit le titre de cette masterclass aussi, à ce qui se passe ailleurs, en particulier en Afrique. Naturellement, à ma complice depuis le tout début et le premier jour, Valentina Volpe, avec qui on co-dirige le master, mais avec qui on a pu aussi mettre en place cette masterclass. Et naturellement, Noémie Delivaneclo, qui se trouve derrière le logo et qui permet à cet événement, malgré les difficultés, malgré la pandémie, d'avoir lieu dans des conditions particulièrement bonnes. Donc, je tenais à le dire et à la remercier très, très sincèrement. Nous avons résisté jusqu'au bout, malgré la pandémie, et j'espère que nous avons vaincu. En tout cas, on en sort tous plus grandis de ce que nous avons très certainement pu en tirer jusqu'à maintenant. Et je ne doute pas que la contribution du professeur de Frouville permettra de conclure en beauté cette semaine de masterclass sur la paix. Merci à tous et un petit clin d'œil à tous les étudiants et à tous les participants parce que ces événements ne seraient pas un succès sans vous, et vous avez prouvé à quel point non seulement vous êtes intéressé, mais vous êtes actif, ce qu'on dit d'étudiant, acteur de sa formation, acteur de ces événements de sa vie facultaire. Tout le long de la semaine, j'avoue, et je vous fais ce clin d'œil-là, vous êtes nombreux à m'avoir bluffé par la qualité de vos questions et de vos interventions. Voilà. Donc, je laisse la parole à mes collègues et je vous souhaite d'excellents débats pour la journée.
Merci, Ioannis. So today is actually an English-speaking day, and so allow me to switch to English and to welcome again Professor Olivier de Frouville for being with us today for our closing keynote speech. And let me introduce Professor de Frouville. So Professor de Frouville is Professor of International Law at Université Panthéon-Assas Paris 2. He's director as well of the Paris Human Rights Center and is a member de l'Institut Universitaire de France. In addition to this prestigious academic career, he has worked for more than 20 years at the UN level, and the UN has been probably one of the great actors we mentioned during this masterclass, and probably can be interesting to see this direct experience of the Professor de Frouville. In June 2019, he has been elected as a member of the UN Committee on Enforced Disappearances. Previously has been a member of the UN Human Rights Committee between 2015 and 2018 and of the United Nations Working Group on Enforced or Involuntary Disappearances. At the domestic level, we continue with a long series of prestigious roles. Between 2009 and 2015, he has been a member of the National Consultative Commission on Human Rights in France. And in the past has been a visiting fellow at the Lauterpacht Center for International Law, that is one of the great Gotha of international law in Europe and in the world, and at the Clare Hall College in Cambridge, where he gets a lifelong membership. His domain of expertise covers international law theory, international human rights law, international criminal law. And in the past year, he devoted a great attention on the role between international law and democratic theory, with a great part as well, of course, devoted on global constitutionalism and constitutionalism generally. And it's actually with this vest that we are very glad to welcome him today. I think this is the missing piece in our international mosaic, in our global mosaic, un peu penser l'universel, aurait pensé l'universel. And I'm so particularly grateful to Professor de Frouville for being with us today. Olivier, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Valentina. Thank you, Ioannis, and thank you also, Sonia. This is a great pleasure for me to join this masterclass. I think this is a great initiative, and this is all the more great that this is now completely available to everybody. So I think it really opens up new doors for knowledge and for the diffusion of knowledge in the field of international law, international relations. I was very glad about the topic, and that's why I, of course, in addition, the invitation was coming to Valentina. I was very glad also by the topic that was proposed to me, and that's why I very gladly accepted to come here to present a few thoughts. So this phrase, beyond the West and the rest, has often been used in the debates on international relations in the last 30 years. I tried to find and to trace the origin of the expression, but was unable to do so. I found it in a famous book by Samuel Huntington, The Clash of Civilization. But above that, I could not find the origin of the expression. One of the recent appearances is in a book by a historian named Neil Ferguson. The book was published in 2011 in its English version and called Civilization, the West and the Rest. And the book is basically about how the West came to dominate the rest of the world from the 17th century onward. According to Ferguson, the West came to dominate the rest of the world from the 17th century onward. And according to Ferguson, it is certainly not Eurocentric or even imperialist to assert that the rise of Western civilization occurred to be the most important historical phenomenon of the second half of the 2nd century. According to him, it is factually obvious. Ferguson then goes on trying to identify what he calls the 6 killer applications that made this domination possible. And he asks the question whether these 6 killer apps are still working today. There are clear signs, he says, that this is not the case and that the world is in fact changing very fast. Whether we will meet a clash of civilization like Huntington predicted, or we are heading on to a crash of civilization, as Ferguson rather seems to preview, we must be prepared to radical change in our perspectives. And I think like the organizers are proposing us in a very smart way, this is certainly the time to try to look at the world map in a different perspective. The question remains, in what sense exactly? For this reason, I find, as I said, this topic of the topic of this conference particularly welcome. I've always been convinced for years now that the way we conceive international law is deeply problematic because it does not allow us to understand the present and to think to the future. The concept of sovereignty in particular, and all the concepts flowing from it, is structuring our imaginary when it comes to international law and the international society, and the way we understand the place of humanity on Earth. If we want to face the immense challenge that are before us, we need to decenter our perspectives, decolonize our imagination, de-Westernize our doctrine, which do not mean, as you will see, completely leaving behind what I consider to be the acquis of the Enlightenment. Beyond the West and the rest is thus a proposal that I fully embrace as a program of research and as a political agenda for the century. I would like to start this conference by first recalling a few obvious facts about international law. International law and the West. That is why, yes, in its origin and concept, international law was and served as a tool for Western domination between the 17th and the 20th century. Second, I would like to acknowledge that international law has went through dramatic change. It would be wrong to assert that international law remains simply the same. But what is the nature of this change? I'm arguing that international law has embarked onto a cosmopolitan process, and I will explain what I mean by that. Third, I will argue that though international law has changed deeply, its main tenets remain Western, and I will try to explain why the West and the rest is somehow inherent to international law. Fourth, and finally, I will introduce some of the changes we should adopt in our way of thinking and seeing things so as to complete the transition from the current situation to a cosmopolitan world. That is a world structured not along the classical dualist perspective of us and the other, but rather along a monist perspective of us into the world. First, international law as a tool for Western domination over the rest. Let me start by recalling some facts that many of you already know. International law, as it was developed from the 16th century, not only accompanied the expansion of the West, but in fact also justified and facilitated the colonial and the imperial project of the Western states. at the time of the Spanish conquests already. Even Francisco Vitoria, which is often seen as the defender of the Indians, justifies the establishment of the colonial settlers and exploitation of the land against their will by jus communicationis and free trade. Later on, the doctrine of terra nullius, that is, a land that does not belong to anybody, justified land seizure by the Western powers from the idea that as the people who were living on these lands were not governed by a proper state, that is, a state as understood by the Western nations, there was no sovereignty, and thus the lands was belonging to the first taker. Universal law, in the origin of international law, meant that those others who did not live as Christians will have to convert to Christianity. Similarly, later on, in order to get them out of the state of nature that the Western people were living them, the structures of modern state had to be developed so as to administrate the lands and the peoples. As the colonial enterprise progressed throughout the 16th century to the 19th century, the European states grew more powerful and structured their relations on the basis of a new European public law, as it was called at that time, which aimed at regulating their relations between war and peace, while allowing their free competition in the conquest of the rest of the world. Classical modern international law, the birth of which is often dated to the Conference of Westphalia, which we see a picture on the slide. This classical international law consolidated this dichotomy between the world of equal sovereign states, ruled by the principle of non-intervention on the one hand, and on the other hand, the barbarian, the half-civilized world into which intervention was allowed, of course, for the benefit of the local populations who needed to be educated, civilized. This sacred mission of civilization was recognized by the League of Nations through the system of mandates. And then again, of course, under a different form in the Charter of the United Nations with the system of trusteeship and the recognition of the existence of non-self-governing territories whose peoples have not yet attained the full measure of self-government. It is not necessary to insist more on these perspectives, which are related to modern international law. They are well known, thanks to the critical readings of international lawyers, and in particular of the so-called third world approaches to international law, the 12s. What I would like to underline is the structure of modern international law as developed in this context, and I will list 6 points here. First, the structure of international law is based on the dichotomy between the state of nature and the civil state. History in the Western thinking, the philosophical tradition, is always interpreted as a transitory process from the state of nature to the civil state, which is not only a moral duty, but is also part of somehow the law of nature. In other words, this is a natural process of how the world unfolds. Thus, civilization, that is, as seen from the West, the modern state, is due to become universal, is due to become the future of all peoples and all territories. Second feature of classical international law, the us and other relation. The question of the relation with the other is dominated by the distinction between the us, civilized, and the other, uncivilized, to be civilized. Those who are not living in a civil state, were living in a state of nature, but who will live in a civil state because this is the natural move, this is the natural process of the world. The history of the relation of us with the other is the history of a transformation of the other as a one of us, because the other is going to be like us, living in a civil state rather than living in a state of nature. This is the natural destiny that they have to experience in the end. 3, the sovereign state. Modern international law is mainly about seizure and sovereignty. And sovereignty is about domination. The creation of modern states themselves, as Carl Schmitt, the horrible Carl Schmitt described, is a process of land seizure, of land appropriation. That is, to echo Emmanuel Levinas, seizure of the being, negation of plurality, of the otherness. The sovereign modern state is a solipsist subject. This is a quite complicated word used in philosophy. What does it mean, solipsist subject? The solipsist is a subject that constitutes the world in and from itself. So in other words, there is no existing world in reality, but as it is constituted within my conscience. Conquered space is part of the territory, and conquered people are part of the population. And the territory and the population, as you very well know, in addition to a government, are the constitutive elements of the state. International sovereignty excludes while it includes. States recognize some other states and do not recognize other entities as states, which thus do not benefit from the status of international sovereignty. In this process, what is inside the state, the population, the territory, remains out of reach of international law. And in particular, the humans, the human being, the individuals which are outside the state are not humans. They are non-nationals, subject to killings in times of war, that is, in times of conflicts between two states. States recognize each other, but ignore human beings, downgraded to the rank of objects of international law, as it is well known in the classical doctrine of international law before the rise of the doctrine of human rights after the Second World War. 4 feature, the mode of socialization of the solipsist subject follows concentric circles. The subject is at the center, and the other subjects are around, aligned in a multiplicity of concentric circles, starting from the close family, going to the neighborhood, the town, the region, the country, the continent, and the rest. All those circles create spheres of sociability and also priorities when it comes to duties, moral duties, and also legal duties. The formation of nation states in the 18th and the 19th century has created an even stronger separation. We could call it a still circle between the circle that contains the nation and the larger circles containing the non-national circles, containing the non-national others. In other words, the circle that separates myself from my neighborhood or my town is quite flexible in a way. It's nearly accessible, while the circle between the nation states and the others is a steel circle. It's very hard to penetrate. 5th feature, the division between the internal sphere and the nation state and the external sphere of international relations reproduces the classical divide between the private sphere and the public sphere. And this corresponds to something that we know very well, which is a deeply patriarchal conception of social life. It is well known that the private sphere is the sphere in the classical thinking, is the sphere in which the male dominus exercises absolute authority over his family, that is his wife and children. This is a purely vertical order. And not only the members of the family have an obligation to obey, but the dominus has a right of non-interference of the society in his internal affairs, that is the affairs of the dominion. Conversely, the public sphere is the sphere of democracy and equality, where males are discussing on an equal footing of public affairs, that is the noble issues. In the public sphere, authority is consented among major capable subjects, whereas in the private sphere, authority is imposed on minor incapable subjects. This is exactly how international law is structured, if you think about it, with equal subjects which are freely discussing and consenting to obligations in the international sphere, and with minor subjects under international law, which are the individuals and to whom the state has a right, and on which the state has a right of command, which is not to be discussed by other states. These 5 points summarize how international law was constituted in the West as a modern concept together with the modern state. Now, having said that, it would be certainly a mistake to say that today's international law has not changed and has not somehow moved from its Western origins. Everything has changed, and this is the cosmopolitan process. International law in the 20th century went through major process of transformation, and I wish to argue a cosmopolitan process. What do I mean by a cosmopolitan process? To understand that, it is important to keep in mind that there has always been two separate theoretical traditions in the history of the doctrines of international law. That of the law of nations, le droit des gens, which was to lead to the theory of international law formalized by Aimé de Vattel, and that of the project of perpetual peace, or cosmopolitanism, from Henry IV Grand Design to Kant projects of perpetual peace. The law of nations tradition was not aimed at prohibiting war. War was considered by the law of nations tradition as a normal means of enforcement, or a form of sanction that the state might use when its rights were infringed. In their way, the law of nations tradition pursued a form of utopia in the idea of domesticating power and violence through law within a system based solely on the goodwill of states themselves. This implied making sovereignty a legal and not a political concept. Sovereignty, rather than an arbitrary power of command, was supposed to become the capacity to consent to be bound by freely accepted obligations. This is something you can certainly, if you've studied international law, you can certainly recognize this is something which is still taught in universities about international law, that sovereignty, at least for the lawyers, this is certainly not the case for the politicians and for the people who are in charge of government, but sovereignty for the lawyers, the international lawyers, is just the power to bound yourself to a certain number of obligations. The cosmopolitan theorists have a more radical aim. They wanted to put an end to all wars, and therefore to establish a general state of peace, which implied eliminating the causes of war and introducing a public body of law. In other words, a kind of legislation that would be valid and applicable to all states, not depending on their consent. Throughout the 17th and to the 19th century, the law of nations theory completely dominated the scene. And in fact, it's still dominating the scene somehow. But from the 17th century to the 19th century, it was only, I would say, about classical international law, the law of nation tradition. That's why it is often called, classical international law is often called a Vatelian theory in reference to Aimère de Vatel, who was somehow the reference of that time for building classical international law. But from the Congress of Peace in 1899 and 1907, and even more so, of course, from 1919, the end of the First World War and the creation of the League of Nations, international law started to integrate the cosmopolitan tradition in positive law. From 1919 onwards, international law was no more only aiming at regulating the relations between European sovereigns and at facilitating the conquest of other parts of the world, the colonial world, but also aimed at reaching perpetual peace. That is somehow a cosmopolitan state of things, a state of the world when most of the causes of war would be eliminated. And you can see on the slide a very good summary of the goal of the League of Nations by that dog, the dog of war. From then, international law is about peace building in the sense of creating the social conditions for peace, fighting ignorance, fighting poverty, social injustice, of course, eliminating tyranny and instituting democracy, and more broadly, all causes of war, all causes of legitimate resentment of the people that may cause war in the end. Thus, the program of international law becomes global in the sense that it transcends the division between the international sphere and the domestic sphere. This seems obvious if you take, for instance, the elimination of poverty. And we have here a slide summarizing the very simple measures to fight poverty, according to a company. It means that international law has to set the conditions to be respected by all states, taking all those measures in all those very complex fields to reach this goal through global, regional, and domestic policies. This is not about contract law anymore. This is not classical international law anymore. This is about general legislation as we know it within our states, applicable not only to states, but also to individuals and moral persons, such as commercial companies. Another major conditions for peace appears to be, and I mentioned it already, democracy. If general legislation is to be adopted by international organizations, that is applicable to us, that is applicable to me, that is applicable to you, that regulates our behavior, then conditions of legitimacy have to apply. And this is exactly the claim which is made in this picture about the WTO back to 2001 in Seattle. More broadly, human rights that are the safeguards against arbitrary power and rights to participation of all citizens to the formation of the law should be protected beyond the state. This cosmopolitan transformation that I've just summarized came with two other major transformations in the state of the world. The first transformation that came together with the cosmopolitan transformation was, of course, the decolonization process. the notable facts about this process of decolonization is that the peoples that finally got rid of colonial powers, they did not choose to create their own political organization. They could have chosen to do something else, you know, than rather than the state, to come back to their own traditions and create their own arrangements of power. They rather decided to join the club. They joined the club of European colonial powers. They claimed the status of equally sovereign states in international law. So what decolonization saw was in fact, the universalization both of the nation states and as a consequence of the scope of what used to be called the European public law, which was only then applicable to European nations. This was universalized to become the law of the international community of states as a whole. The second major transformation, which came together with cosmopolitanism, with the cosmopolitan process, was economic globalization. That is the expansion of capitalism at the global level. Of course, it began as far back as the 18th century, but it was somehow slowed down by the rise of an alternative model, which was represented by the USSR and its allies. But as it is very well known, the fall of the Eastern Bloc gave way to the triumph of capitalism and the globalization of markets. From the 1990s, international economic law enlarged its scope to the world and extended its tenets to all economies, with the unprecedented consequence that the global economy as a process took over and completely superseded all political processes. The economy became first before politics. We are now at the point where no domestic government is able to counter the logic of markets, but at the same time where all governments are, with only a few exceptions, I must say, like North Korea, for instance, are keen to enter the game of market economy and global markets. These elements make enough clear, I think, I hope, that it would be a complete mistake to consider international law as if it had been unchanged, as if it were still classical international law of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century. That is a mere tool for the Western powers to conquer the world. This is not how things are. A blunt assertion that would be made today that international law must be decolonized is thus missing the point. Formally, international law cannot be suspected of being colonial. States representing peoples who had been submitted to colonial powers are now equally independent states. They are full subjects under international law with the capacity to conclude treaties, form international organizations of their own, and participate in international lawmaking. They can also have their disputes settled by international tribunals. They have all the rights that the status of sovereignty can offer. So what is the issue with international law today? Why can't we say that we are not quite beyond the West and the rest? The fact is that having a community of equal sovereign states, following the structure, the original structure of international law as it was founded in Europe, does not mean that we have created a cosmopolitan society. So nothing has changed somehow. Nothing has changed the inherence of the West and the rest to international law. International law has been certainly decolonized if we consider that this is not the property of Western states alone, but we still can't say that we have reached the state of beyond the West and the rest. And there are at least 6 reasons that we can mention to support this. The first reason is that the concepts of international law come from the West. Even if international law has a universal reach, it is based on concept, it is based on theories which were forged by the Western philosophical tradition. The universalization of international law is the universalization of the modern state and of its structure, internally and externally. All territories and peoples are now governed, at least formally, by the same type of political administrative complex that we call a state. All states, for instance, have a ministry, and all peoples, by consequence, have a Ministry of Foreign Affairs. All states appear with the same decorum, all use the same terminology, and all use, strangely, the same rhetorical arguments taken from Vattel's international law, like principles of non-interference, blah, blah, blah. Although some of the rules have changed and the goals have changed, the foundations remain the same. In particular, sovereignty, of course, remains a pillar of the constructions of contemporary international law, with its internal and external dimensions. The idea that there is a strict separation between an international sphere, which is the world of the states, and the domestic spheres, which are the worlds of the individuals, is still solidly entrenched in the way we see things, in the way we read and understand the world. This is not only the structure of the legal orders, this is also our mental structure. For instance, domestic legal orders generally recognize that the validity of norms of international law is based on domestic law, which, if you think about it, is a typical solipsistic way of thinking, of seeing things. That is, the world is constituted in and from myself. International law is only valid to the extent that it draws its validity from my law. In other words, we are mentally trained to think of the international as a separate world, both as a physical reality and as a legal phenomenon. This is not to deny that a global approach is, of course, progressing. And we have had this week fantastic lectures about this global views on the international order. But there is still a long way to go so that this global view, this, I would call it cosmopolitan conception, prevails. And the fact is that we don't have much time. The second point, the second reason why we can say that we have reached the status of beyond the West and the rest is because our representations of the world are still deeply impregnated with preconceptions inherited from the colonial imperialistic past of the West. In other words, if norms of international law are well beyond the West and the rest, sometimes they are, the psychological approach to the norms remain often unchanged. In particular, views that the West is civilized and that the rest is uncivilized, barbarous, chaotic, remains a common view. This has an influence on how Western countries and peoples, but also peoples from the global South, in fact, see their roles, conceive their own position, and frame their own mental categories. There are various figures that we can mention in this regard. The figure of the big stick, that is the one who's in charge of maintaining order and discipline, especially when facing a somehow chaotic situation. It is still commonly viewed that the West, and especially, of course, the United States of America, as the task of maintaining and establishing law and order in the rest of the world. including through military intervention if needed. And you have a small picture here, which comes from the intervention of the US in Somalia in the beginning of the 90s. The figure of the Good Samaritan, that is the one who helps the unfortunate other, the West still sees itself, and is often seen, in fact, by the rest of the world, as the one who has a moral duty to exercise charity towards the rest by providing funds for development and humanitarian assistance, including against the will or contrary to the wishes of those who are assisted. The figure of the good apostle, Western countries are willing and are seen to be willing to convert the rest to the orthodox doctrine of democracy, the rule of law, human rights, and free trade. Of course, the West thinks that this is for the common good, but the rest often keeps its own view on how states should work and how power should be exercised. A third reason why we haven't reached the status of beyond the West and the rest is that international law remains strongly patriarchal and gendered. And this is, of course, to be expected, as patriarchy, as I argued before, is contained in the very structure of sovereignty, as the division between the international sphere, conceived as the public sphere, that belongs to man, and the domestic sphere, seen as the private sphere, which is the domain of the women. It would be false to say that patriarchy is exclusive to Western culture, of course. But the universalization of the modern state and of international law based on this dichotomy between the internal and the external are somehow had the effect of entrenching and comforting patriarchy in the rest of the world. The feminist critiques of international law, like Hilary Charlesworth, Christine Chinkin, and many others, are of course right to say that the state is a male person. And the Chilean women of Las Dices, formed after the violent crackdown on peaceful protest in 2018-2019, were right to sing and dance that el Estado opresor es un macho violador. The state is the capable person at the international plane. He is the warrior, but also the taker, the one who takes possession of the body of others through military conquest, invasion, so as to make the world its own. The main goal of the solipsist self is to confirm and strengthen its solipsist perspective, and thus dominant position of the world and the others through a destructive dynamic. The sovereign state is a rapist. The focus of international relations, thus, is that of a competition of power between those warriors. States like to compare their powers and are looking for more power in comparison to other states, to have the biggest army, the strongest economy, the most influential culture. States are like children and are making spectacle of themselves, playing childish games each time they are comparing their respective powers in international debates and negotiations. But these games are causing thousands of deaths, massacres, famines, and injustice all over the world. Fourth, we cannot say that we have reached the state of beyond the West and the rest, because the structure of sovereignty still makes it difficult for us to establish a dialogic and equal relation with the remote other. Sovereignty works as a principle of inclusion-exclusion, as I said. And this is very hard to overcome. The subjects are inside and the others are outside. Sovereignty means protection for those who are inside through the force of law, but conversely, sovereignty means indifference or even hostility for all those that are outside, who should then be submitted through the law of force. The other foreigner is a stranger. The other foreigner is strange and thus should be kept away. The figure of the migrant is, of course, a case in point. Very often under domestic laws, the migrant is the one to whom we are legally bound not to help. The criminalization of the assistance to migrants in Europe and other parts of the world is an obvious expression of how sovereignty operates. It prohibits us to express our solidarity to the other who is not the subject and who is dealt with accordingly through the use of arbitrary force. More broadly, the fact that states are equalized with nations creates large groups of peoples which are fundamentally strangers to each other and at least suspicious, at worst hostile to each other. Because states are large, this relation of enmity reaches catastrophic scales in case of armed violence. The two world wars are wars of sovereign states between them, not wars of peoples. Even more troubling is that sovereignty also excludes inside the community of subjects. The other is also the one who finds himself or herself at the margin of society. Ethnic or sexual minorities, people on the move, peoples who live in the streets, those who live behind bars. These are logically inside as subjects, but they are ousted because they do not conform to the figure of the subject to be protected. Therefore, they are deprived of their rights, can be discriminated or even killed. Genocide is a state crime, and to be carried out demands a state-like power and a state-like administration. It is aiming at the elimination of the other inside to keep the house clean and ordered. International human rights law and international criminal law are international norms which are now fully integrated into international law that tend to counter this narrative and these effects of sovereignty. Of course, they can be activated to defend the rights of the others outside, like the migrants, or inside, like the minorities. And in the sense, they are tools of resistance against how the world is structured, but they still do not structure the world. Another fifth reason why we are unable to go beyond the West and the rest is that international economic law and sovereignty have served the globalization of markets. Capitalism, as an economic model, follows the same logic of seizure of the being. It sees the world and peoples as a resource to be incorporated for the sake of its growth, and the growth being pursued for nothing else but the growth. It is a complete mistake, unfortunately too much widely shared, to consider that the project of sovereignty is able to counter the infinite expansion of markets. It is also a deep mistake to think that cosmopolitanism would be somehow the counterpart in political philosophy of neoliberalism. In fact, the project of sovereignty serves the purpose of the globalization of markets because it prevents the creation of a global governance of the economy. The global economy and economic international institutions can continue under a sovereignty structure, can continue to claim not to be submitted to general international law and to the law of the United Nations in the field of human rights or development, for instance. The World Bank, for instance, continues to claim that it is not bound by international human rights law and by international environmental law, because its mandate is strictly focused on economic issues. It's of an economic nature, which is completely separated, which should be separated from other social issues. Meanwhile, international economic law is creating a world without borders for capital and markets. Finally, the sixth reason why we haven't reached the stage of beyond the West and the rest is because we find it difficult under the current structure to think of ourselves as being part of what I call, between inverted commas, as nature, what we could also call the biosphere. Sovereignty is a deeply subjectivist scheme with the consequence, and again, I mentioned this figure of the solipsist subject, conceiving the world in and from itself, with the consequence that the relationship with nature is always thought as a relation of subject and object. It follows from this that, as Descartes have said, man makes himself as masters and owners of nature. And so nature is merely our environment. It is what literally environs the subject. And the relation that we have established with this environment is strictly instrumental. We see nature as a resource, as something to be used to increase our power, to intensify our existence. For the solipsist subject, nature, animals, plants, and rivers have no existence by themselves. They are either incorporated or to be incorporated to me to serve my purpose and the intensification of my existence. The right to a healthy environment, if it is actually fully recognized and put into application as a human right, will simply slow down the destruction of nature, but won't be able to prevent it because it is still based on the assumption that nature has no existence by itself, but only through the relation it has with the humans. So it is clear that even though international law has gone through a cosmopolitan process, we have not reached the state of beyond the West and the rest. And this cannot happen. This will not happen until we decide to get rid of a certain number of concepts and ideas so as to make the final turn that will transform international law into cosmopolitan law. And this is my fourth point, beyond the West and the rest, accomplishing cosmopolitan law. So as we've seen, cosmopolitan law and world citizenship are already in part a reality, thanks to the transformation that happened throughout the 20th century. But there are major transformations that still need to take place before we can say we have gone beyond the rest and reached a cosmopolitan world. Of course, if we think of the cosmopolitan agenda, we think of institutional and legal reforms. And this is generally what the literature about cosmopolitanism is about. And I myself advocated and worked on a certain number of what I call my cosmopolitan building sites, like the abolition of the veto of the Security Council, the creation of a robust and fair status for participation of civil society in international organizations, and more broadly, the recognition of a right to participation in the work of international organizations, the UN Court of Human Rights, etc., etc. But here in this conference, and with the time that is left to me, I would like rather to focus on another dimension of the cosmopolitan agenda, which is the psychological and ideational reform we must achieve if we want to decisively move beyond the West and the rest. I've addressed a lot until then the mental structure that are supporting the legal structures, and I will continue to follow this path. Well, we will not overcome the divide between the West and the rest, us and the others, if we do not work on the way we perceive the world. And it can only happen through culture and the education of children and the education of the adults, if adults can be educated. I think we should work in particular on three relations. First, the relation with the other, which seems obvious after all I have said. We must learn to consider the other not as a stranger, a strange person, but as a human being. It seems simple as that, but it's in fact a very complicated thing to accomplish. As such, and the difficult thing to understand in this is that the other is another self, is someone like me, but he's also the one who is not me. That is a person who is characterized by her absolute otherness, and thus must be respected. Not only for being like myself, but also for being radically different. And this is something very complicated to achieve again. We must educate ourselves against our solipsist incline and the solipsist incline of the sovereign state, which tends to appropriate the other through seizure, so it becomes another self, an alter ego, thus completely negating its difference. We must learn to adopt a cosmopolitan attitude towards the strange. That is, to be in a listening position rather than being in a judging position, which is also very hard to achieve, being in a listening position rather than judging. We tend to judge immediately things, situations, people. We must train, and this is again a hard exercise, to think of the margins as if they were in the center. To mentally train ourselves to move the margins towards the center, not meaning that the margins are really at the center, but that we should think of them, of the margins as being in the center. We should train to make the margin move nearer to the center. We must practice towards the other what Kant called the cosmopolitan right. That is the right of visitation as a mark of respect for the infiniteness of difference of other people. Again, something very difficult to achieve in the relation between the stranger and the national. The right of visitation, which is in fact a completely respectful attempt to establish a relation with the other. International human rights law, I believe, is one of the legal tools, if not the legal tool, that can help us to give life to this cosmopolitan education, to give legal meaning to this cosmopolitan education by recognizing that others have equal rights despite being others. But domestic law will play as a constant obstacle, being thought and tailored along the structure of sovereignty. So part of the education must be the need to criticize and in fact to resist to laws of the states that prevent or prohibit us to see the other as an equal person. The laws of sovereignty that work along the process of inclusion and exclusion. This should be done, including through civil disobedience by groups of citizens of the world. That is transnational, national, of course, but also transnational, or even non-national cosmopolitan networks of citizens acting non-violently against the same exclusionary laws in different countries. Second, we should rethink our relation to the state. We should train ourselves to be less mentally statists and more cosmopolitans. We should start by always thinking of ourselves as both citizens of our states and citizens of the world. Like Marcus Aurelius, my city and country, so far as I'm Antoninus, is Rome, but so far as I am a man, it is the world. On this basis, we should demand our right to participation for all decisions that affect us personally or as members of our community, and communities, I should say, because we belong to different communities, to various plural communities. But we should also demand our right to participation for all decisions and rules that affect humanity and the biosphere as a whole. We should think of autonomy as a principle which is applicable beyond the national polity. We should not restrict autonomy to the national polity. This is what makes us prisoner of our world. National politics today has become meaningless for a number of global issues, not for all issues. I'm not saying that the national level of decision has become completely meaningless, of course not. There is a principle of subsidiarity that should apply. But for a certain number of global issues, the national decisions have become meaningless. The national level has become meaningless. This, of course, appears clearly as we're facing climate change. And that, for instance, President Bolsonaro from Brazil opposes national sovereignty against demands that he takes measures to stop the destruction of the Amazon rainforest. I claim that I have, as a citizen of the world, a right to participate in the decisions related to the Amazon rainforest, which cannot be considered as the dominion of one state, as the property of the state along the old structure of sovereignty. Similarly, I personally claimed recently, and I was questioned about that, and I had very interesting discussions. I claimed recently my right to participate, at least symbolically, in the US presidential elections and to cast my vote for Joe Biden, as I thought that the re-election of Donald Trump would have had major global consequences and would probably have led the world to the brink of disaster. I call this last US presidential election a cosmopolitan election for that reason. That is a national election within a national polity, but with global consequences, which justifies global citizens' participation. Also, sovereignty is majesty. We should stop being dazzled by the state's majesty. the signs of its grandeurs, the golden walls of its palace, and the luxury of its lifestyle. Very often, even in our democracies, in our old democracies, we still see the Leviathan in place of the state. A great Superman whom we fear and from whom we beg protection. And still too much often we tend to think of the prince, the president, the prime minister, as the incarnation of the state, as the Leviathan himself, as the protective image of the father. And finally, third, we should rethink our relation with nature. Until sovereignty remains the foundation of our concept of state and international law, we will continue to perceive ourselves as distinct from nature. We are in fact both part and probably also distinct from nature. We are fully autonomous in the sense that what makes our dignity as a human species is to take decisions that may go against nature, or that is, against what we understand from our human point of view as being the order of things, the order of nature. But at the same time, we should take consideration, we should recognize and pay respect to the fact that nature, the biosphere, has its own rules, its own program, so to say, which is completely independent from our will. We're not commanding the biosphere. We're not able to control. The solipsist subject is willing to control, to seize everything, but it cannot control nature. It cannot control the biosphere. Very often what happens, in fact, in the biosphere is beyond our comprehension, despite the fantastic progress of our science. We should thus cultivate modesty, respect, and caution in front of the biosphere we're part of, and which is also our only home in the universe. Of course, these 3 points, these 3 relations are not an exclusive list, but what I would like to underline here is that not only legal and institutional change are necessary following a cosmopolitan agenda, but also a cultural change in the way we see things, in the words we use. Our imagination of how power is exercised among humans won't change without changing the laws, but the laws won't be changed if we have not a clearer view of what we need to change. The bulk of the matter, I submit, is a shift from the dualism of us and the other to a new perspective where we should conceive as us being in the world with the others, the group of others being expanded beyond the humankind to the biosphere. A few words of conclusion. We want to go beyond the West and the rest, or at least some of us want. Of course, not all of us want to go beyond the West and the West, but let's say I assume, and I personally, as I said, I embrace this agenda. Why? Not because we think that the West is evil, but because we want to avoid the domination of one part of the humanity on the rest. We think this is somehow unfair. Don't want to discuss further the notion of justice here, but this is this deep feeling that this is unfair. And also because we feel that the legacy of the West has certainly bright sides, but also has dark sides. This is not about throwing the baby with the bathwater, to take a trivial expression. We have to recognize firmly that there is an acquis of the Western experience and the Western philosophical and political tradition, that there is an acquis of Western modernity and of the Enlightenment in particular. And we have to recognize that this has become somehow universal, that this was probably also present in other cultures, but this is the way it was formulated in modern times, and that this is something that is claimed all around the world. And in particular, we would be willing to keep the idea and the key idea of autonomy, because this is only by realizing this idea, by making it more intense, by intensifying in a certain way the promises of the Enlightenment, that we can hope to create the conditions under which there will be no domination from one part of the world over the other parts of the world. So the cosmopolitan transition we are aiming at is not about finishing the West and the rest to face a situation where we'll have, for instance, the East and the rest. Similarly, this is not about coming back to a kind of holistic thinking. There is no way back. We need to reinvent words and concepts to invent our future. For this, we need to actively counter nationalistic trends in every country. And this is not being non-national or being against the nation. We need to fight nationalistic trends in every country. And we need to express ourselves both as being part of our nation, being part of our groups, being part of our communities, but also being part of the world as cosmopolitans across border. We need to create transnational networks of cosmopolitans to rethink our economic models, get involved in global issues and discussions, and realize how much global they are. Claim a right to intervene and have a say in other states' political affairs, but also in issues dealt with at the level of international organizations. In other words, cosmopolitans of all countries unite. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very, very much, Olivier, for this wonderful final keynote. Personally, I could not have imagined a better conclusion of this week, where we really refound some of the fil rouge. I think about the need of finding new vocabularies to think in a different way. I think about the necessity to go beyond in the West and the rest, but also your lucid and clear analysis of why we have not been able to go beyond the West and the rest so far, and what is the roadmap to go there. And I like very much also the reference you did to education, to culture. We are here also giving our very tiny contribution to this agenda, try really to ask new questions and to expose students to different way of thinking. And I'm really, really grateful for this wonderful final keynote. I won't take any more time, and I would like instead to give the floor to the numerous questions that we have. I will collect the first couple, and I would give the floor to Augustine Hack, and Victoria Marie. Augustine, you have the floor.
Perfect, thank you. Thank you, Professor, for this presentation. I think you really delved into the foundations of international law in quite a refreshing way, and proposed, in my opinion, very interesting solutions to alter our relationship with state and nature. You argued, and I think quite agreeably, that cosmopolitan society is yet to be achieved, and we still rely on concepts and representations of international law that are quite Western. And ultimately, sovereignty seems to continue interfering with the postulate supporting democratic participation. Hence, my question here being, how do you think can we resolve international law's inherent political dimension, which can as easily contribute to a cosmopolitan legal order, as well as inhibit its development and really inhibit civil society's participation? And that especially in the light of disparities in development and resources between countries, and thus between peoples, which to me inevitably will generate differing economic priorities and thus political discourses.
Victoria Marie, we will collect two.
Yes, so good morning. My name is Victoria Mariletia, a student in Master 2 in Human Rights. So first of all, I would like really to thank you for your intervention that I believe we found very instructive as international law students. So my questions relates to a worry that I also think we share as students about the future you foresee for the international organizations in the cosmopolitan society that you depicted. I was particularly thinking about a reference that you made in an article you wrote in 2001 about with reference to Kelsen, sorry. So this article was in Conception démocratique du droit international. You were explaining at the time that international organizations appear to be transitional organizations charged with establishing the foundations of an international society for the establishment of perpetual peace. So concerning this reference, I have several little questions. So what did you mean by transitional? Did you consider that these organizations were meant to disappear? Maybe it is linked with the quest of autonomy that you mentioned on global questions. And given the evolution of the international community since 2001, is your position on the topic the same or has it changed? Thank you.
Augustine, could I ask you just to repeat the beginning of your question, because I missed just the beginning, so which was I think the most important part.
Which was okay, I can repeat. So I can reformulate, but basically my question was about what solutions can we find, or if there are any, to resolve the political dimension of international law, which to me inevitably eventually leads to can contribute to cosmopolitanism in the same way that it can inhibit its development and inhibit civil society's participation, for example. So for me, the main question was about the political dimension of international law.
Political.
And how that can, yeah.
The political.
Yeah, political, yeah.
What do you mean by political? By a political dimension of international law? What do you mean by that?
Well, for me, that relates to basically the sovereignty of the state. So the idea that the political power has a strong decision power still now in the international legal realm. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's precisely the agenda. I think that the issue is that we see power concentrated in the state. I mean, there has been multiple critics from the 70s that draw attention on the fact that power was somewhere else in the society, that it was not exclusively within the state, that the state was not only the only tool of power, but somehow tool was diffused within the society. And this was, I mean, for instance, Foucault's analysis was very useful to draw attention on the fact that we also have to master power, and we also have to create rules to channel power within those other institutions, you know, which are not only the state. I think as far as international law is concerned, we're still there. We're still in the 70s, where we'll see power within the state and exclusively within the state. For instance, we immensely ignore the power which is exercised by international organizations. We completely ignore completely, I wouldn't say that. There are movements which are trying to draw our attention on the power of the global markets and of the global economy. But we generally, as international lawyers, we are educated not to see that. Even if you learn international economic law, you will be explained that there are fantastic international economic organizations which are here to liberalize trade and to create wealth and to better organize the world economy. But there is no explanation of where is power and how this is power which is in fact acting through this international economic globalization, and how in fact there is a complex interplay between the state sovereignty and the globalization of the economy. This is something we don't see. This is something we don't learn. I mean, of course, unfortunately, there are some social movements and especially people who are themselves suffering from these movements, which are drawing our attention on these consequences. For instance, if you read the World Bank's reports, this is a fantastic institution whose goals is to alleviate poverty. But if you read reports from people who are forcibly displaced by their governments in order to allow the construction of the dams, which are financed by the World Bank, then you read the story otherwise, you see. So I think that the important thing is to decenter our view, is to understand that power is somewhere else. It's not only situated and located in the state. And from that conscience that power is also somewhere else, we will start seeing the states otherwise, and seeing that the state is not something sacred. It's not the Leviathan. It's not the benevolent protector of the people. We have to try to, and that's also the remarks I was making about the grandeur of the state, all this decorum that is around the state. We have to get rid of this somehow. I'm not proposing that the international One Planet Summit does not take place in the Élysée. I think it's nice, but I mean, in a way, this is problematic because it carries with it this image of the state as being the sole decider, as being the sole protector, as being the sole debitor of benefits, of wealth, and this is not the case. This is not the case. This is not how things works. In fact, this is an illusion somehow. So, I mean, I was also talking about childish games. I often attend, especially meetings of the Human Rights Council, but I also attend remotely meetings of the Security Council, for instance. This is incredible. This is like a cours de récréation, the children playing together, insulting themselves. They're not dealing with serious things. They are comparing their power. They want to be the most powerful. They want to gain. They want to win. Da, da, da. This is like they want to take revenge. So these solipsist subjects, which are in fact exercising their power, which only aim is to increase their power, is to increase their seizure on the world, is something we have to put an end to. And this will put an end to I wouldn't call it the political dimension of international. I think the political is everywhere. I mean, everything is political somehow. The political is taking decisions together. The political is living together in a city, in a country, in the world. This is political. But for me, there are different definitions of political. I mean, there's the Carl Schmitt definition of the political, which is the enmity, which is the opposition between me and the others. But I don't understand the political activity as being this. But I think he was in a way correct in describing the political relation as a relation between me and my enemy, when looking at the world as it is, and as it was structured through modernity and through the concept of sovereignty. I think in a way, he was quite right. And that's exactly what we have to deconstruct. Victoria Marie, the international organizations are transitional. In fact, the cosmopolitan institutions that have been created since 1919, I generally date the start of this evolution even at the end of the 19th century with the Congress of Peace of 1899 and then 1907. But this is, the real start, we could say, is the League of Nations 1919, which, as you say, is a Kantian organization. I mean, It was inspired by no contested President Wilson for other reasons, but and is often said that Wilson had the perpetual peace, Kant's perpetual peace, and was reading the Kant's perpetual peace when he was thinking about the League of Nations, and the name of the organization, of course, is very evocative of that goal. And as I was saying, from that moment, the international law. The goal of international law is changing. The goal of international law is not just regulating the coexistence of the sovereigns, of the princes, and trying to keep peace and reestablish peace when there has been war, or setting a certain number of rules when there is war, organizing Congress for peace, etc., and distributing the powers. From 1919, this is another story. This is the idea that we're going to construct a perpetual peace. That is also the words which are being used in the United Nations Charter, which is peace and security. Peace and security is not only peace, it's not a peace after the war, it's the security of the peace. So that means it's secure peace. So that means going back to the causes of war, which are of course injustice, tyranny, poverty, which are creating the wars, which are, in a way, there is a natural aggressivity in all of us, of course, but there are elements which are working on this aggressive pulse, and which are making it collective, and which are transforming it into a war, okay? Into a conflict, into a group war, into a group aggressivity, okay? And the goal is to work on these causes. It's not to change the human nature. And Kant often says, we're not about changing, it's not about changing the human nature. It's not about eliminating our aggressive pulses or pulses of death. This is going to stay. This is how we are. This is trying to find the right engineering so that we channel this power and this aggressivity to reach the goals we want to reach, and to stabilize somehow as best as possible the social organization. So from that moment starts a transition. So I mean, and even in the mental structure that is inherited from the classical philosophical transition, I was saying that the classical philosophical transition figures are is about a transition from the natural state to the civil state, okay? And so the goal, which is assigned to the international organization from 1919, is a transition from the stage of nature, where states are plunged, to a civil state. It's exactly how Kant is expressing it. He says basically we have to create a civil state at the international. As the individuals have gone out of the state of nature to create the states, now we have to create a new transition whereby the states will go out from the state of nature to create a civil states at the international level. That's probably the idea. So these institutions are institutions of the transition. From now there, all institutions, all international institutions are partly, at least, because they are partly remaining under the structure of a sovereignty, because they are composed of states, they're intergovernmental structures, etc. But their goals are, in fact, cosmopolitan goals. So they are cosmopolitan institutions to some extent. And their goals is to transition from the state of nature to the civil state at the international level. So all international organizations, including the United Nations, are transitioning organizations. They accompany the transition. There is something a bit tricky in this, because of course, the mistake that we may make in interpreting the mission of these organizations is that they may be a transition towards the creation of the world state, which is often something that is said about cosmopolitanism. This is a huge mistake. Kant explicitly said that there is no chance that we will have a world state. And this is not about reconducing sovereignty at the international level. So we're not going to go beyond sovereignty at the national level to create an international sovereign. This would just, be reconducting the same problem. So in a way, the transition is infinite. There's no end to the transition. This is a process. And that's exactly the idea that Kant was expressing when he was using this expression of the theory, the Federation of Free States. Mm-hmm. The Federation of Free States is, in fact, it's a contradiction if you think about it, because the Federation is, in the classical doctrine, a federation is a federal state, mm-hmm. which means that the components have no sovereignty. Mm-hmm. So they cannot be free. So you either have, if you think in classical terms, you have either have a federation or you have free states, but you cannot have both. Mm-hmm. So what Kant meant was that it was a process. It was a conciliation between going beyond sovereignty and keeping sovereign. I don't like sovereignties as you understand, but at least independence. So it's unanimity and plurality, of course. It's also this interplay between creating the unity of power while keeping the plurality of peoples. This is not about unifying the peoples. And again, in the end, I said, I'm not against the nations. Okay, this is something also which is a mistake which is often made. Cosmopolitanists are against the nations. They're against the peoples. They don't want people to keep their identity, their cultural traditions. No, this is not true. This is, we can easily imagine a world where all the peoples, and by that I'm not only talking about the nations, the nation which are defined in fact by citizenship, which a nation is people belonging to a certain state in the modern meaning, which means, for instance, that the Palestinians, that the Kurds, they are basically out of the game. So you can continue to be a Palestinian, you can continue to be a Kurd, you can continue to be an Englishman, a French person within a cosmopolitan world. It does not erase plurality. It's a transition. It's a conciliation between the plurality and the unity of power.
Thanks a lot, Olivier. We have actually 5 more questions that we can try briefly to collect. Probably we can give, first of all, the floor to some of the audience questions. So Makoto Nakagiri, I can then ask you to introduce yourself. Then I will read a question from Lenaïque Jean, students of Master 1 International Organization. And I will give the floor to Raphaël Drozewski, du ministère de l'État et des Affaires étrangères. Please.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Olivier de Frouville, pour votre intervention. So my name is Makoto Nakagiri. I am a Japanese diplomat from the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs working in Geneva, and I'm taking a year of sabbatical. I am taking a sabbatical year. And so my question is about the notion of development and this Western domination of international law. So we hear that some of the countries of the third world use the term development or even the right to development to counter the Western interventions. So for example, in the Human Rights Council, when the European Union criticized China by arguing on their actions on Xinjiang and Hong Kong, the representative of China counter-argued that it is not, that they are not violating human rights, but they are just securing the development and security. For China, it is rather the United States or the European Union who are violating human rights because they are not taking effective measures on the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'd like also to refer to the recent movement on the draft convention on the right to development. So I think it is clearly a movement to counter the Western-led regime of international law, especially on the international human rights law. But when I read this convention, it seems that it ignores, to some extent, the rights of subalterns, the subaltern. So it does not seem always to be the best solution to go beyond the West and West. And lastly, I like to refer to the recent movement of the approach from the Western side to the West side, especially in the sphere of human rights, such as human rights-based approach, and also the right to life with dignity, which has also referred to by the Human Rights Committee. So I just like to hear Professor Olivier's opinion about this development point of view to counter, to try to counter the West centrism of the international. Thank you.
Thanks, Makoto. I would actually give to everyone the possibilities to ask the question briefly. And of course, Professor Olivier de Frouville can pick and choose in the answer or collect some of them. I will read two questions since the authors asked me to read. So, Jeanne, do you think that the future of international society is really cosmopolitanism? Or do the Western countries help the development of the rest of the world while maintaining a selfish interest in domination? And then we have Raphael. Bonjour, Raphaël Drozewski, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing, du ministère de l'Europe et des Affaires étrangères. Je remercie le professeur de Frouville pour sa stimulante présentation. Si nous faisons l'hypothèse que l'idée cosmopolitique était intégrée par certains États, gouvernements, places, populations, qui souhaitent avancer dans cette direction, comment intégrer dans une dynamique cosmopolitique des puissances potentiellement agressives qui, peuvent représenter un danger pour la société de ces États et donc de l'idéal cosmopolitique, du fait du maintien d'un imaginaire fort de la souveraineté entretenu par les autorités dans leur population, refuser de travailler à la cosmopolitisation pratique des DH au nom de la domination de l'Ouest qu'ils imposeraient. Et encore, cela requérait d'être capable d'avancer avec deux imaginaires simultanés, même transitoirement, point d'interrogation. Cela implique-t-il aussi que ce mouvement vers la cosmopolitique ne peut être que mondial, simultané, même si graduel, dans les différentes parties du monde? Donc, riche question. Olivier, you have the floor, and of course, feel free to summarize, to pick and choose.
Thank you very much. So, first about Makoto's question, and very glad that you're taking a leave and that I may meet you also sometime in Geneva when we will be able to go back there. I mean, development for me is a real question. I think there has been a very bad record of policies of development from the end of the war, basically, till the beginning of the 80s or the beginning of the 90s, which was basically a Western-driven conception of development, which was very pragmatic. I think it was corresponding basically both to the Good Samaritan image that I was presenting, and also to an ambition, in fact, to create the conditions for the expansion of capitalism, and also to fight, of course, the competitive model, which was the USSR, the communist model, which was in front of that, which also proposed its own version, Western version of development, somehow to say, because communism is a Western conception. It's not a non-Western conception. In the 80s, something happened which was, I think, interesting with the rise of the right to development, which was basically a negotiation between the South and the North, or the South and the West, as the South was claiming that development was had some priority over the civil and political rights and democracy, and the West was trying to find a kind of balance between the two. And so the result was a kind of a negotiation that came out with this idea of an individual right to development, so a right to development that could be claimed as a human right. And this was continued by the very interesting approach which was developed in the 90s, which was the human rights-based approach to development. I think this is the only way we can get out of the development conundrum if we are to get out of it, or if we don't have to reinvent completely something else. in a way, development can only if it has to be meaningful, can only be based on human rights, can only be based constitutionally. I mean, the constitution of international development law must be international human rights. And the basis for development must be participation of those who are supposed to receive some assistance. But more fundamentally, what I think is that, as I could probably start to express, I think we really have to work on the structure of the economy, on the global economy. I think this is, I mean, in a way, we can try the best we can in the current structure to improve things, to fix a number of defects, but we won't change the general structure, which is fundamentally, I wanted to call it, but I thought it was a bit too complicated in conference, a meta-solipsist structure of the economy, in a sense that, you know, the states are solipsist subjects, so they are working for their own intensification, for incorporating more and more territories, peoples, etc., having more and more power. That's the logic of the state, of the solipsist subject. But the global economy recreates the same scheme, but that at another level, at the upper level. And it in a way, it creates the situations where the states exercise their own solipsist function to serve the solipsist action of the global economy, which is growth for growth, you know? Economic growth for economic growth, the augmentation of wealth for the augmentation of wealth. This is the logic, huh? Using more resources to use more resources. So I think until we have not changed or we rethought this way of functioning, this is going to be difficult. But I agree as a first step that we have to reintroduce, as you call them, the subalterns, that we have to reintroduce the margins, that we have to reintroduce the people which are completely forgotten in those policies of development. And this is based on non-discrimination, this is based on human rights, this is based on right to participation. We really have to unleash the powers of those of human rights in the policies of development, but we're far from that right now. Raphael, this is a very complicated question you are asking, and I hope we have other opportunities to discuss it further. I don't think, I mean, Kant used to say that if you want to build a cosmopolitan society, you don't have to do it with a people composed of angels. You can do it with a people composed of devils. And this is basically what we are, and this is basically what the states are. There are no good states in a way. There are only states which are pursuing their own interests. So states are machines against their solipsist subjects. So they're machines to defend the national interests. And the national interests are diverse, you know, and of course there are governments that sometimes have a more cosmopolitan view, but we can also see that it depends on the election cycles. So for instance, and this is probably the most cosmopolitan election, as I said, and the most cosmopolitan policy or polity. The US has cycles. So once you have a Trump, which is completely anti-cosmopolitan, and then you have Biden. So, you know, you have to play with this, and you have to consider that the strength of the process has to come from, not from the states themselves, but from I would say beyond or below the states. I really believe, and as I was concluding this talk on the power of the cosmopolitan networks, I was talking about the necessity of civil society organizations to be involved in international organizations, work, I'm really interested to push an agenda of the democratization of international organization. I don't believe, for instance, that if we want to reform the Security Council more than it is reformed right now, and not to say that there are no reforms, I think there are, I mean, there has been huge steps which have been made in the last 20 years. But if we want to solve the conundrum, which is the veto in case of mass crimes, in case where a state goes too far somehow, we're not going to do this only with the states. You know, this is not coming from the states. This would only come from an international, transnational, cosmopolitan mobilization, strong mobilization coming from civil society. The issue that we have now is that, for instance, people start to become aware of climate change dangers, but they're not aware of the danger, which is to keep a Security Council with the veto power, which is in fact a real danger for humanity, including for climate change issues, you know, because we have basically an instrument that doesn't work, that doesn't play the role that it should play. So yeah, this is just my just one quick response to a very complicated question. But I think there is no alternative. Just to answer the last part of your question, there is no alternative to be inclusive. I don't think we can build cosmopolitanism based on a state, you know, a club of democracies, for instance, like, you know, we have to include China in the discussion, and China is very positive on some aspects, it's very negative on some others. So we have to play also dossier by dossier, and in a very pragmatic and realistic manner. I mean, utopian realism is my my word.
Olivier, yeah.
There was another question by...
Maybe it was a reflection about the future, that we can probably end on a reflection on the future. It can be a beautiful ending.
Which was basically, are we going towards a cosmopolitan world, or are we staying with the sovereign states, right? That was the...
Yeah, exactly. The international system is really going towards cosmopolitanism.
You know, I'm no prophet, and so I can't say, I just can't say what is the future. What I can say is what I can try to figure out, and what I think is the role of academics beyond the politicians to try to figure out is what we should do. You know, what are the correct decisions that we should take now, for now, taking into consideration the things that we know. And when I say the things that we know, we really have to have knowledge. And this is not something easy. You know, having knowledge of the situation is not something easy because we acquire knowledge through mental structures. So we see the world and we see the reality, you know, the social reality, only through our mental and theoretical structures. This is something we often deny. We pretend to see the reality, but we don't see the reality. We only see the reality that is proposed and is filtered somehow by our theoretical assumptions. So my point is that if we really want to have knowledge and try to start making proposals, we have to change the lens. We have to change the theoretical assumptions, because the theoretical assumptions on which we are working and we're trying to see the world and understand the world and make proposals at the moment are theoretical assumptions that date back to the 18th and 19th century. In a world which was completely different from today's world. So we cannot continue to use the same categories. Otherwise, we're completely incapable of taking the good decisions and trying to figure out what will happen next.
Thanks a lot, Olivier. I think this is a wonderful closure. The fact that we need to think beyond the state and with new categories, new vocabulary. And I think this is also a beautiful wish for young students of international law and human rights. And I don't want, again, I apologize. I know that there were few more questions, but unfortunately we are running out of time. Maybe there will be the opportunity to ask them or in a written form or in another occasion. I thank very much Professor Olivier de Frouville for this wonderful final keynote of our masterclass, that is not only a masterclass beyond the West and the rest, but it's also about global actors. And actually, I think the global actors, regional actors are definitely part of the Cosmopolitan project and process that enrich the international law discourse towards common values in which we believe. I would give also, of course, the floor to my co-organizer to add a final reflection and a greeting in this final day. On my side, another big thank to all, to the co-organizer, to the students of the Master 1 and 2, Human Rights, Security and Development, to our distinguished speakers who have been with us this wonderful enriching week, and to all the audience and participants who arrived really for numerous countries of the world. We arrived to be 200 days, and over the week more than 300 people attended this masterclass from all over the world. So not all the webinar comes from evil. We have been quite happy with this online version. I give the floor to Sonia, and probably Ioannis will conclude with a few words. Thanks again on my side.
Merci Valentina, effectivement, merci beaucoup professeur de Frouville pour cette conférence de clôture qui rend tout à fait dans le cadre effectivement de cette semaine masterclass et qui conclut parfaitement tout ce qu'on a entendu cette semaine. On a finalement eu un consensus sur l'évolution du système international, la nécessité de décentrer le regard, quelques pistes de résolution de ces problématiques, et ça ne sera pas de trop de faire la prochaine masterclass sur la même thématique pour peut-être creuser aussi les solutions qui ont peut-être déjà, qui existent déjà, ou des initiatives qui peuvent exister pour combler ce gap entre the West and the rest et décentrer le regard. Alors ça peut être un peu tarte à la crème de dire ça, mais quelque chose qui m'a vraiment frappée aussi cette semaine, et j'espère qu'on pourra aller plus loin. Je ne pensais pas au début de la semaine que nous étions autant à tel point dans les mêmes démarches en droit, en sciences politiques, en histoire, en tout cas pour les 3 disciplines qu'on a pu entendre, même en sociologie, dans ce questionnement de décentrer le regard, pourquoi ça n'a pas été fait. Enfin, on a vraiment les mêmes conclusions, les mêmes approches, on n'emploie pas le même vocabulaire, on n'emploie pas les mêmes mots, on n'a pas la même méthodologie, mais on est vraiment sur la même longueur d'onde là-dessus, et enfin, c'est sûrement quelque chose à creuser. C'est vrai qu'on travaille tous un peu en silo, on lit les politistes, on lit vous lisez les juristes, et il y a peut-être plus de ponts à créer. Donc moi j'ai découvert déjà beaucoup de panélistes et de réflexions de juristes et d'historiens sur les mêmes sujets, donc ça a beaucoup enrichi mes propres travaux et propres recherches. J'espère que ce sera pareil pour les étudiants. Que vous avez aussi vu ce qui se passait ailleurs, alors ailleurs dans le monde pour décentrer le regard, mais ailleurs aussi dans vos disciplines, pour voir ce qui se passe dans les autres disciplines, et vous voyez qu'on a beaucoup de choses en commun et il faut vraiment qu'on approfondisse les discussions ensemble. Alors merci beaucoup donc à tous les participants toute la semaine. Le Zoom nous permet de dépasser les océans et d'avoir des gens d'un peu partout dans le monde. C'est au moins l'avantage qu'on a avec cette semaine. Merci beaucoup Valentina. Toujours un plaisir de préparer avec toi ces événements. Merci Ioannis Panoussis qui va dire quelques mots. Merci beaucoup Noémie d'Eli-Van-Eclos pour tout ce que tu as fait pour la masterclass. Et petit clin d'œil aussi à Sofiane, son époux, qui nous a fait une superbe musique tout le long de la semaine que vous entendiez au moment de vous connecter avec le clip. Alors je passe la parole pour conclure à notre doyen Ioannis Panoussis, qui aura peut-être quelques mots à dire pour terminer.
Merci Sonia. Tout d'abord, un grand merci Olivier, cher professeur de Frouville, pour cette contribution qui est effectivement, comme l'a dit Valentina et Sonia, une magnifique conclusion, une magnifique jonction, je crois, de point de vue de ce qu'on a pu entendre tout le long de la semaine. On voit bien que tout ça a du sens. Pourtant, vous ne vous étiez pas rencontrés, les différents intervenants, qu'ils soient politistes, juristes, historiens, comme le disait Sonia, et on voit quand même effectivement cette logique, cette cohérence qui émerge. Alors, je suis ravi personnellement, et j'enlève ma casquette de doyen, un, de constater cette cohérence, et deux, d'avoir ce sentiment, même si ça fait joli aussi, même si ça fait un peu trop monde des bisounours, avoir ce sentiment d'avoir fait un pas en avant sur un certain nombre de choses. Quand je vois effectivement 250-300 connexions, malgré le contexte sanitaire que nous connaissons, avec cette interaction qu'il a pu y avoir avec des questions-réponses, je pense que la richesse est là et qu'il y a ce souhait de pouvoir avancer tous ensemble. Donc, quand on annonce de manière un peu naïve ou idéaliste qu'on veut effectivement que ça puisse servir de base justement pour qu'il y ait de nombreux ambassadeurs demain au profit d'un monde meilleur, pour la paix et pourquoi pas pour une société plus cosmopolite, en tout cas pour un droit international qui intégrera cette dimension. Je pense qu'on n'est pas loin d'atteindre l'objectif qu'on s'était fixé. À titre plus personnel et en tant que chercheur, j'avoue que je regrette par moments mes fonctions de décanal parce qu'elles ne me laissent pas le temps d'être plus actif sur ce genre d'échanges et de forums. Je suis convaincu depuis, et Olivier comprendra bien, depuis la découverte avec ma collègue Hélène Tigoudja de la Cour interaméricaine, je suis un grand convaincu que les courants de l'humanisation du droit international sont des courants que nous devons prendre en considération, qu'il faut changer de perspective. Olivier en a parlé un tout petit peu quand il dit qu'il faut aussi qu'on agisse en citoyen du monde. L'ancien président de la Cour interaméricaine, actuellement juge à la CIJ, avait cette envie justement de pousser très fort vers un regard différent du droit international qui intègre la dimension humaine et un peu moins peut-être la dimension étatique et contractuelle. Et ça, ce sont des choses auxquelles on croit. Et je pense que le regard croisé droit-sciences politiques, droit-relations internationales, il est plus qu'indispensable. Il y a eu une question sur laquelle j'ai souri parce qu'elle paraissait compliquée avec justement la dimension politique du droit international. Il y a une vraie dimension politique, qu'on le veuille ou pas. Donc, assumons aussi, quand je dis politique, là, ce n'est pas avec un petit p, hein, c'est bien avec un P majuscule. Effectivement, en tant que juriste, on a parfois tendance, alors ce n'est pas le cas de tous les juristes et surtout pas des personnes qui ont participé là, mais on a parfois tendance à dire le droit, il est objectif, donc le droit, il n'est pas politisé. Le droit international, malgré ses imperfections, on essaye de faire en sorte qu'il réponde à des impératifs objectifs, etc. Il faut assumer une dimension politique avec un grand P. Quand on parle de cosmopolitanisme ou quand on parle justement d'humanisation du droit international, il y a une dimension politique à notre discours. Elle est noble et je pense que c'est celle que souhaite porter cette masterclass et c'est celle que nous continuerons à porter à l'édition 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 20 parce que c'est un processus sans fin. Je pense que le professeur de Frouville l'a dit, ce sont des actions au quotidien, ce n'est pas du jour au lendemain une transformation. Et c'est comme ça qu'on inscrit le mouvement qui est le nôtre. Et s'il y a une chose qui est fondamentale, et avec Valentina, on s'amuse souvent à faire ça aussi dans nos cours, c'est de dire que avoir une richesse de point de vue, ça n'est pas avouer une forme de relativité du droit et du droit international, c'est plutôt mettre le doigt et pointer le regard vers une forme de pluralisme. Donc, il faut voir les choses et le verre à moitié plein et pas à moitié vide. Et c'est ce regard positif, optimiste que nous proposons pour vous, pour nous, pour le monde dans lequel on vit. Donc, merci à tous et je vous souhaite, merci Olivier. Je suis obligé de mettre fin officiellement comme j'ai ouvert, donc je déclare fermé ou la clôture de cette masterclass 4e édition. Mais je suis impatient justement d'ouvrir la 5e qui n'arrivera pas dans 1 an, mais dans 9 mois. Donc voilà, et j'espère que nous aurons cette opportunité d'accueillir aussi en physique à nouveau nos intervenants, nos étudiants, tout en gardant peut-être quelques éléments positifs de la dématérialisation, puisque le monde entier était avec nous sur cette masterclass, et c'est un vrai clin d'œil que je souhaite faire en remerciant particulièrement Sonia, Valentina, Noémie pour tout le travail qu'elles ont fait pour mobiliser leur réseau et pour faire en sorte effectivement que le monde entier puisse nous accompagner sur cette semaine. Bonne continuation à tous et vive le droit international et les relations internationales et la science politique. Voilà.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci à toi, Olivier.
the very right to be human is denied every day to hundreds of millions of people.
Dans ce temple des Nations Unies, nous sommes les gardiens d'un idéal. Nous sommes les gardiens d'une conscience. La lourde responsabilité et l'immense honneur qui sont les nôtres doivent nous conduire à donner la priorité au désarmement dans la paix.
We've got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop.
Chaque génération, sans doute, se croit vouée à refaire le monde. La mienne sait pourtant qu'elle ne le refera pas. Mais sa tâche est peut-être plus grande. Elle consiste à empêcher que le monde se défasse.